And it's not only the things that we intend to kill that's a problem, it's also the unintended consequences of what we do, what we call bycatch. It's a real problem. It's what my colleagues in the military call collateral damage. Oops, sorry. So here's an example of collateral damage that comes from this coast, okay? These are glass sponge reefs. They are globally unique in Hecate Strait, but bottom trawling is a profound seafloor disturbance, and one or a very few passes of a trawler can eliminate these glass sponge reefs. So you have to ask yourself, what's the price of this activity, as well as what is the benefit? Where is it appropriate to do this, and where is it not? And I'm proud to say, Living Ocean Society of Soinchula and the Ecology Action Center and Marine Conservation Biology Institute worked together on a project to look at the collateral damage caused by fishing. Not overfishing, because you can overfish with almost any gear. But what are the unintended consequences of doing so? And what we found is there's an enormous disparity between the least harmful fishing gears, which fish very cleanly, and the most harmful fishing gears, which have enormous collateral damage. So where we fish is the next step. We now know that in Canada and in the United States, there's a tremendous difference between the cleanest and the most unintentionally harmful kinds of fishing. Now the question is, where should we be doing what? Where are we willing to make the trade-offs? I'm interested in why societies choose to fail or succeed, as was Jared Diamond, who was actually one of my professors in 1970 when I was a pup, when I was at Catalina Marine Laboratory, and Jared took us out birding, and I got to know him a little bit. This is a wonderful book if you want to understand what sustainability is and isn't. And I want to give you a little bit of Norsean theory here, okay? As it turns out, for a very, very long time, people have been using the oceans. Hundreds of thousands of years in East Africa, we have seen evidence of human use of the oceans. Here in North America, it's a number of millennia. And the question you have to ask yourself is, why do some societies succeed and why do they fail? What are the ingredients underlying sustainability? And so I've taken a crack at this, okay? Like I said, I'm a thief. I look at things that other people are doing and other people are saying, and I pull them together. And this is my list. First of all, 3 things. First of all, the sea has to be healthy. Its capacity to produce life has to be essentially undiminished. The more you diminish the capacity of the oceans to produce life, the harder it is for you to sustain any of the things you care about from living oceans. The second thing is, in sustainable societies, technological change has by and large been very slow, because when we have technological advances that increase our ability to exploit, we often don't have other mechanisms that catch up with them and serve as a counterbalance. I mean, anybody who's ever met wealthy families know that the kids in wealthy families have to be taught how to spend. If they don't, they often spend at a high rate, and they deplete the capital on which their income depends. So if you have the ability to exploit faster and faster and faster, you have to be smarter and smarter about controlling your appetite. And the third thing, and this is really the crux, everything else in my talk is going to come from this. Exploitation was localized, and by that what I mean is people didn't have the ability to go from one place to another. People were pretty much stuck where they were. I mean, there weren't very many seafaring peoples in the world who could go thousands or hundreds or even tens of kilometers from home. So because they were localized, that meant people had to know the living systems where they lived, and they had to have social, religious mechanisms. In Hawaii, they're called kapu, but in other societies, the laws have different names. But they had to determine where people could do what and when. And that's really a big thing. In other words, it wasn't a free-for-all. This was considered to be a privilege. But what's now happening is that we are going from place to place to place, and we're depleting the marine life, and then we go to the next place, and the next, and the next, and we're running out of places. And Fikret Berkus at University of Manitoba, it was the lead on this wonderful paper in Science. That image you see there shows sea urchin exploitation starting at the end of World War II in 1945. And that's where Japan exploited them in 1945. And then in the 60s, it's the orange circle and the blue shape in the 70s, and the green shape in the 80s, and the brown shape in the 90s. Basically now, instead of Japan eating sea urchins from Japan, Japan eats sea urchins from the world. There is a globalized market for sea urchins. And we don't have compensatory mechanisms to deal with that. And as a result, sea urchins everywhere are being depleted. But it's not only fishing. Fishing is only part of the challenge we face. There are lots of new activities that are claiming ocean space. Space-consuming activities like oil and gas, and wind farms are coming, and aquaculture and marine reserves. All of these are staking a claim to places in the sea. So as we stake more claim, as we consume more ocean, what are we going to do about it? Well, we have a really, really dumb system in the United States. I always like to think that Canada is better, but I have a feeling from what I've heard here that it's not better. It's just different names, but the same story. In the United States, each sector, each kind of activity is managed by a different agency. And here is the list in the US. And the important thing here is that what each of these sectors does affects all of the others, and that has consequences. Because if you have one agency managing one sector, or more or less something like that, what happens with the interactions? Who looks out for them? It's also a problem because each of the sectors gets very close to its regulators. We heard that earlier in our an excellent talk. And because that happens, regulators start seeing the sector as their sector. Hi, I work in government, and I'm here to support the oil and gas industry, or I'm here to support the fishing industry, or I'm here to support the telecommunications industry. And the problem is, what about the people who aren't in those industries? Well, that's not my job. My job is to oversee this industry, and that becomes a supporter of that industry. And government can become captive of the industries it regulates. And because they ignore each other's interests, the one thing I think we can be pretty confident of is that biological diversity is always the loser. Now, I've been asking myself for a long time, since I started working on oceans and forests, what's the biggest difference between the sea and the land? And there are obvious answers. One's wet, one's not. One's bigger, one's smaller. All those are trivial, irrelevant. The biggest difference between them, in terms of conservation, is that in the sea we have sectoral management. Different authorities govern different activities in the same place. On land, you generally have, for any given place, you have one authority, one chief, one owner, one agency, one committee. Okay? So it's a different game. The decision-making structure is fundamentally different.